So, with the New Mutants right around the corner, I've decided to revisit the granddaddy of this whole X-Men movie franchise. And despite having watched this movie several times when I was younger, I honestly didn't remember it that well, and that's partially because the X-Men movie series is kind of a mess chronologically. We had this original trilogy, and then a prequel, and then a different unrelated prequel, and then a spin-off, and then a time travel movie slash soft reboot, and then two sequels to the reboot, then a movie set in the far future that doesn't make it clear if it's part of the original or rebooted universe, plus two movies that aren't clearly connected to any of these stories and are more just parodies of the X-Men universe. And now we have this new movie that also isn't clearly connected to either timeline and might actually be set in the MCU? What? My point is that the continuity of this series is pretty confusing, but that's not important because the whole franchise will probably be hit with a hard reset button pretty soon as Disney finds a way to bring it into the MCU, and also because the original trilogy can pretty much stand on its own. Anyway, back to that. I decided to rewatch the original movie, and I was kind of surprised to find out that it was actually really good. That probably shouldn't be too much of a surprise, given that it was well received by critics, and it gave way to this pretty massive franchise, and I'm honestly kind of a shill for this franchise. Yes, Origins was garbage, and The Last Stand and Dark Phoenix were pretty disappointing, but I think that even Apocalypse was a solid superhero flick, and Days of Future Past and Logan are some of my favorite comic book movies, and even those bad ones still have some pretty awesome moments in them. But still, the X-Men are big enough in the comic world that Fox would have tried to make more movies even if this one was bad, and it very easily could have been bad. Now that I think of it, I would argue that X-Men is one of the most ambitious superhero movies ever made, especially for its time. From what I can gather, superhero movies before the year 2000 usually only featured straightforward plots with only one hero who was already a household name. Instead of buying the rights to Spider-Man or the Hulk or some other hero who could follow this formula, Fox went with this ensemble movie with no main character, featuring spandex-clad mutants with names like Cyclops and Magneto, that's also trying to be taken seriously as an allegory for civil rights. That is a tough movie to pull off, but with a tight concept, spot-on casting, and a creator who clearly cares about the source material, it could be done. X-Men is not a perfect movie, but it has a lot of great ideas, and I was never bored through its entire runtime, and I was only annoyed a couple of times that I'll talk about later. Given the messy extended universe that I associate with this series, I was surprised by how tight this movie's throughline is. Like I said, there's no clear main character here, but it's incredibly easy to follow because there's always a very clear threat on the table, and all the characters are laser focused on dealing with that one threat. First, it's Magneto and Rogue being exposed to mutant discrimination and finding the X-Men. Then it's Robert Kelly being mutated and discovering Magneto's plan. Then it's Rogue getting kidnapped. Then it's the X-Men trying to rescue her and stop Magneto. Yes, there is a fair amount of exposition, even some that teases other movies, but it always comes with character development. The opening Congress scene reveals Kelly's prejudice against mutants. Xavier's dialogue at the mansion reveals his history with Magneto. Wolverine's flashback reveals the sexual tension between him and Jean. The movie never puts itself on hold just to flesh out the world for a sequel. Speaking of the characters, they're pretty much all great, and the casting is damn near perfect. Some of the X-Men aren't really fleshed out until later movies, and some of them aren't even fleshed out in the later movies, but everyone has at least one cool moment, an understandable motivation, and they all serve their purpose in this narrative as well as they can. The best interpersonal conflict in this movie is the one between friends turned enemies, Xavier and Magneto, and I'm so glad that it's developed further in the sequels. I seriously think that Magneto is the second best superhero movie villain of all time, just behind Heath Ledger's Joker. Pretty much every single one of his lines is incredibly eye-opening, and sometimes I genuinely get the feeling that he's wiser and more worldly than Charles. Plus, his dark backstory as a Holocaust survivor totally explains how he became this way, and also fully convinces me to see this movie about spandex-clad mutants that shoot lasers out of their eyes as a serious allegory for minority rights. This movie really did remind me that superhero stories can say quite a lot about the real world, which I would argue that only a couple of MCU movies have managed to do. And it's not like this movie doesn't have its share of funny moments either. They're not based on quips like the MCU movies, and I will admit that some of the laughs I got might have been unintentional, but the movie does a really good job at occasionally lightening the mood by poking fun at the goofy comic book style adventures that ensue. particularly using Sabretooth, who is a hilariously incompetent henchman, and it seems like the creators are aware of this. Now, this movie has its flaws, including one really big one, but the list is pretty short. For one, this really surprised me as I noticed this, but Hugh Jackman is not yet perfect as Wolverine. He actually really works in his low-key emotional scenes, but during the action sequences, it really seems like he's trying too hard to act like an animal, and he doesn't learn how to tone this down until later movies. Besides that, given how ambitious this movie is, there are bound to be a few plot holes here and there. How did Sabretooth know how to track down Rogue in the middle of northern Canada? Why did Magneto just leave Wolverine to report Rogue's kidnapping back to the X-Men? How does Wolverine do this? How does Magneto get his powers back even though Rogue isn't done operating the machine? And if he does, why doesn't he use them to slow his fall? I don't know the answers to any of these questions, but they don't really matter because they're easy to miss, and I don't think I noticed any of these problems in my first viewing. But the last one is tied to what is, in my opinion, this movie's only problem that can't be forgiven. And that problem is Rogue. See, I'm of the opinion that if you're writing any sort of action or adventure story, then every major heroic character should make some sort of meaningful contribution towards solving the conflict. Whether that's fighting bad guys, providing information, saving another good guy, just providing emotional support, or anything else that helps tilt the stage toward the protagonist's favor. To me, making every character contribute toward the solution is just as important as giving every character a relatable motivation and a likable personality. Rogue is nothing but a liability toward the X-Men, and not only is she one of the most important characters, she appears to be the main character for pretty much the entire first act. She's the first mutant that we're introduced to outside of the opening flashback sequence, and we follow her for the next 20 or so minutes before we realize that she's crucial to the villain's plan. Does she fight back, or even voice her opposition, or even remotely understand what's going on? Nope, she's just a vehicle for Wolverine's character development in the first half of the movie and a damsel in distress in the second half. And I know that Rogue is a naive teenage girl who doesn't know how to handle her powers or deal with their consequences. I don't expect her to be some hyper-competent badass, and I'm fine with her being captured. In fact, that plot point about Magneto transferring his powers to her was actually really clever. Just give her one heroic moment and I would have been happy. Like maybe when Magneto regains control of his powers in the climax, she could have snuck up behind him and stole them again. But nope, she just sits there and screams. This is like Bella Swan levels of character agency deficiency, and it's really disappointing. The only good news about this is that Rogue's screen time is pretty low in between the first act and the climax, so if you just forget about her character, you'll have a pretty good time with this movie. Anyway, thanks for watching this video, and if you have any comments on this movie, be sure to leave them down below. I'll try to get to reviewing the New Mutants shortly. See you all later!